Okay, this will be the first of likely two lectures for Chapter 3, the Biosphere. First two chapters are kind of laying out the basics. I guess more so chapters 2 and 3, like basics of the physical environment. Chapters 3 and 4 are a bit more of the adaptations and interactions with the environment. So we'll move into ecology and then, evolution, and then move further into ecology. And so right now we're just going to get like a basic understanding of the physical structure of the world, really, and what terms to use and sort of how to understand that. And then we'll get a bit more into the ecological examples later on in the course once we can develop a baseline understanding. So for this chapter, our key concepts are the terrestrial biomes are characterized by the growth forms of the dominant vegetation. Biological zones in freshwater ecosystems are associated with velocity, depth, temperature, clarity, and chemistry of the water. Marine biological zones are determined by ocean depth, light availability, and stability of the bottom substrate. The book kind of makes this contrast between North America and the Serengeti Plain around the diversity of animals. And talking about the Great Plains of North America having a low diversity and large stands of uniform crop plants and few species of domesticated herbivores. So this is what they're trying to do, is draw an analogy between the way both of those places looked 50,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, and how there's been a few things that have happened in North America that are different. One is the Pleistocene Holocene boundary extinction, and then two is a massive change from a open, more natural, wild, if you want to say, landscape to one that is primarily occupied by single crops. With very low diversity, large tracts of land that grow soybeans or corn, where we've really moved to a much, much lower diversity. So here's an image of the Serengeti showing a large amount of wild herbivores. And then here's an a conceptual diagram of the Pleistocene animals in the Great Plains. If you're not familiar with the Pleistocene extinction, it's really pretty fascinating that we had an amazing diversity of large megafauna that all went extinct about 14 to 12,000 years ago. Mastodons, short-faced bears, ground sloths, there's a horse, there's a camel, there's this massive diversity of animals that we had that kind of all went out around the same time. And this has been the source of a fair amount of debate, that about 10 to 13,000 years ago, many of the North American large mammals went extinct very rapidly. Hypotheses on the cause of the extinctions involve rapid climate change and the arrival of humans. This is saying that the role of humans has been controversial, and primarily a lot of those early arguments were very black and white. It was either climate or it was people. And I'll present some information here that's arguing for a mixture of the two. So this is a figure from Metzler's 2015 paper that's giving the genus of species along with their weight distribution. So it's kind of an interesting graph. So here's the woolly mammoth is the largest one. down to, I'm not even quite sure what these things are, but they're quite small. And the image of somebody with a spear is to indicate which species were hunted. So his there has archaeological evidence that shows the genus being hunted. The argument here is that the extant genera are red. I'm colorblind, I think they're red. Seems kind of a weird color. You think they'd be green. And then the extinct ones are this blue color. So the red ones are still here. The blue ones are now gone. The image of the individual holding a spear is to indicate those genera were hunted. And so the argument they're trying to make here is that, well, we've got species that were hunted that are still here. We have a few species, by this diagram, 5 that were hunted that are now extinct. But how do you explain all the other species that we do not have archaeological data for them being hunted? There's a few explanations for this. One is archaeological evidence is not the end-all be-all. Specifically, it's really hard to make an argument based on negative archaeological data. Well, we've never found it in the archaeological record, so therefore it never happened. The amount of filtration material has to go through to show up in the archaeological records is pretty amazing. What I mean by that is here in the Northwest, archaeological sites are typically what we call shell middens, which are piles of shell with other refuse mixed in. There's other sites as well, but that's primarily what we're talking about. Here we're looking at usually what they call either kill or processing sites. So we're looking for piles of bones and that bones that have tool markings on them, and then the evidence of tools nearby. These are evidence that's, again, on the order of 10 to 13,000 years old. Much of this was not, it's harder for it to preserve because it was typically, we got to think about it like in the arid Southwest, or if it was in the Great Plains, the likelihood is it's been plowed over by now. So particularly when you had either differing numbers of people or mobile people, it's hard to find that evidence of animals that were killed 13,000 years ago, and to find that today. If you think about how many archaeological samples we have of, say, woolly mammoth, I don't know the number, but not hundreds of thousands, not tens of thousands. I don't even know if there are thousands. So that's a problem, that very little of what was done 14, 12, 13,000 years ago we can find today. So we're making data based on negative information. But I think there's some validity to this point that there's a massive loss of species that were not associated with human activity, or we wouldn't expect them to be associated with human activity, or that's a broad suite of taxa to go out pretty quickly due to hunting, as well as there's a lot of other species that did make it through that transition that would have and are actively hunted. So it's an interesting diagram to think about. Size of the organism, what would extinct, what didn't, and then what has evidence of hunting. Oops. And then this is that same sort of data, but in a table. So this is the occurrences, number of fossil occurrences and number of archaeological kills. And so these are extinct genera, surviving genera, and the total. And so here the number of fossil occurrences for extinct genera is 312, surviving 170. Archaeological kills, 15 genera, and 111 surviving. what they're trying to say is that you would expect if that archaeological kills or evidence in archaeological sites was the primary driver um, of decline, you would see a similar ratio, meaning that here you've got 300 genera that went extinct and 170 that are surviving. So that kind of gives you a ratio between the two, where there's more that are extinct than they're surviving. And then looking at the ones with archaeological evidence, there's only 15 that are extinct, and then there's 117 that are surviving, based on the archaeological information. So it's saying that of the extinct genera that were associated with archaeological kills, there's actually a relatively few number in the absolute sense of the number of species that went extinct between 10 and 12,000 years ago. And so he presents two scenarios. One is 30,000 years ago, the megafauna populations were doing well. Everything was doing well. Humans arrived, and there's a precipitous decline at the arrival of. He's calling them Clovis hunters. Clovis is the name of a tip from Clovis, Texas, I want to say. And for the longest time, Clovis was thought of as the first humans on North America. That has since been altered by increasing evidence of earlier people in North America earlier than Clovis, what they now call pre-Clovis. And then in Native American communities, people refer to their time, their family's time on the landscape as since time immemorial. And so that's not putting a date on that group's occupation or existence in North America or on the landscape. So dates get really tricky and controversial and touchy. So I'm presenting a few different statements here, but I want to define what Clovis is in the eye of the author. And so when they say Clovis, that's really what they're referring to. It's not a cultural group. It's a type of projectile that was used. And so here, populations are popping along. Clovis hunters show up, populations decline. An alternative hypothesis would be that due to climatic factors, primarily drying and warming, particularly the Midwest and Southwest, populations were declining, and humans helped them to the end of the road, but not necessarily. It's hard to say what would happen without people on the landscape. Meaning, maybe small populations of mastodons would have survived or been able to migrate, but people helped as well. So more of things are in decline. People came along right at this time when there were lots of large mammals on the landscape and helped that decline further. So sort of an additive property as opposed to everything was fine and then people overhunted them. And so I think it's an interesting. It's like 20, 30 years ago, there was probably more kind of arguments about it. To me, it's pretty widely accepted that it's a combination of factors. There are groups out now. I forget the name of them. I don't spend time reading their stuff. But there are groups that want to rewild North America. So the argument is things like camels and mastodons and lions, larger lions than the African lions. These short-faced bears that were huge. Harlan ground sloths were massive. If you ever get a chance, go to Marcus going on side notes. The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. It's absolutely amazing. but there's a group that wants to rewild the West, and so bring these animals back, or their nearest relatives, which come from Africa, and let them go in the landscape, because humans contributed to the loss of these things. So as humans, we have a responsibility to bring them back. You can Google it. They've got little, videos and stuff out, but not necessarily something I totally subscribe to. So with that out of the way, we can start to go through some terms around what we call different parts of the earth and the ocean. And I'll jump over some of the detailed descriptions of each individual biome. But it's worth being familiar with the characteristics associated with each one. So the biosphere is the zone of the earth, the zone of life on the earth. It lies between the lithosphere and the troposphere. So litho meaning stone, the earth's crust and upper mantle, and the troposphere being the lowest layer of the atmosphere. That's where everything generally happens, in between the hard parts and the float away parts. And biomes is a word we use to describe large-scale terrestrial communities shaped by the physical environment, typically characterized by the dominant plant growth forms and characteristics such as deciduous or succulents. The reason we use plants is plants occupy sites for a long time and are good indicators of climatic conditions and disturbances. So if we think about, we're trying to define an area by the animal life, well, many animals move, so that's a problem. And two, you can have a lot of long-lived plants, and so for something like a cedar tree or even is it foxtail pine, some of the other pines that live to be thousands of years old, where there's living examples that are over 2,000 years old. For something to live to be many hundreds of years old, a certain suite of conditions have to be met. And those conditions include both temperature and precipitation and the timing of both of those, as well as the extremes of both of those. And I've mentioned prior, and I'll probably keep mentioning that, that averages don't drive ecological distributions, extremes do. So the point is that, if we look at averages, you could have a couple years of rain, let's say, and rabbit populations will explode. Well, the cedar trees in the area have been through this before, and they've been around for hundreds of years, and so they're a better indicator of large-scale extreme drought and temperature than the shorter-lived organisms. We can look at a few general types of plants and what they're typically associated with. So there's sclerophyllous shrubs, sclero like bone. They're typically in seasonally dry and moist environments. Deciduous trees, they're moist, seasonally warm and cool, on fertile soils that are warm and seasonally wet or dry. Grasses and sedges, they're moist seasonally, warm and dry with fire. One thing they mention in the biome by biome description is the use of fire. And I think we'll get into it later when we talk more specifically about some of the ecosystems. But the use of fire is really important, particularly for managing or keeping open savanna-style landscapes. They reference it, I believe, around on the continent of Africa, but fire is also a big tool that has been used here in the West, in the Salish Sea for thousands of years as well. Cactus and shrubs, hot, dry, evergreen with broad leaf trees, warm, wet and warm year-round. Forbs, seasonally cool or cold, and needle-leaved evergreen trees, warm, moist, seasonally warm and cold, or cool cold with infertile soils. So this is kind of an interesting diagram or way to think about what's that relationship between temperature and precipitation and where different ecosystems or biomes fall out. So tropical rainforest being one extreme. As the word rainforest implies, a fair amount of precipitation and reasonably warm, as the word tropical implies. And then you can have the same temperatures but no rain and be a desert. The interesting thing about desert to me is it's typically defined by precipitation. So you can have very cold deserts. Most of eastern Washington or parts of eastern Washington are technically considered deserts. And then on through evergreen forest down to tundra. So it's interesting to think of it along that continuum, and they kind of makes sense when you think through it. So this is the distribution of these biomes on Earth based on that prior sort of idea of temperature and precipitation. Where would we find what? So this is the potential distribution of the biomes, which differ from their actual distributions because of human activity. Meaning, it's no longer a forest if we cut it all down and plant wheat or alfalfa. And by doing that, we can also alter the hydrology of the system, alter the soil conditions of the system, and fundamentally shift it into something different. So this is one way of looking at what biome should be there, and then we can compare it to what is actually there. This is the global distribution of areas affected by humans. This that's from Sanderson et al. 2002. There's been a couple other studies as well looking at roughly the same thing, and the argument is that there's really impact everywhere, particularly when we start thinking about the distribution of toxins via aerosols, carbon dioxide, etc. And then we move on to more direct impacts as well. So the human footprint is everywhere. This is kind of a heat map showing where it's most extreme, and so you can see these hot pockets around coastal zones, around the eastern and sort of eastern Midwest of America. Europe is another bit hot area too. And then the zones of tropical deforestation. This is one where they did me very few favors. Remaining tropical forest is green and clear tropical forest is red. Yeah, I can see some red. So tropical forests are being cleared at an alarming rate, generally for the development of agriculture or pasture land for animals. What's the word? Livestock. I'm looking for. So this is a giant impact on biodiversity, as there's a massive amount of biodiversity in these systems, as well as the ecological integrity of those systems is fundamental to maintaining the local weather and climate. So as we deforest these areas, we disrupt the hydrological cycle, and further cause increased drought and other issues. So it's happening at quite an alarming rate. 40% of the terrestrial carbon is stored within the tropical forest biome, and the loss of these forests means both the lower ability to take up carbon from the atmosphere and the greater emissions of greenhouse gas from the soil and decaying vegetation. So frequently sort of a 1-2 punch as far as removing the ability to sequester carbon and then releasing increased carbon through it, particularly when we think about moving tropical forests into intense livestock operations. So the convergence of succulent plants shown as cacti in the Western Hemisphere and euphorbs in the Eastern Hemisphere. This is the, and we'll talk more about convergent evolution. But the idea that it's sort of interesting that we have this similar sort of shape of organisms, both plants and animals, that developed in totally different areas because they're exposed to similar environmental stressors. And when we get into evolution and further topics, we'll deal with that more. And here's an image of the two side by side where they look quite similar, but they're unique branches. They're not related to one another. They evolved independently of one another. Bats can fly and birds can fly, but they're not related. And then a bit, let me see where I want to take a break. Oh, the smokes, I got a lot there. Let's see. Yeah, let's get through freshwater and we'll take a break at marine. Stream order is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When two streams come together, they become second order. And then when additional streams comes in, then they become third order, fourth order, etc. The idea is that with that, there's typically a gradation in the type of organisms that are there and what that stream looks like. So if we think about small, narrow tributaries up in Mount Baker, they're steep, water's flowing quickly, they're typically shaded on all sides, typically have a larger substrate. Compared to higher order streams, which are lower in elevation, they're typically flatter, they're typically moving more slowly. The body of the river is typically exposed to some sunlight, which allows photosynthesis to happen, so they can generate some primary productivity within the system, as opposed to the lower order, the primary and secondary order streams, first and second order streams, that are reliant on detritus coming in from trees and plants surrounding it. As with that, there's a gradation in the type of insects that live there, how they make a living, whether they chew up bits of plant matter or if they're able to graze or graze on algae and things like that in the lower orders. So we can think about these using words that are pretty similar to kind of what we use in oceanography. One is, of course, the benthic zone. Benthic, benthos just means bottom, benthos. The main channels being the larger order streams where fish and things are moving around. And these organisms that live in the benthic zone are typically eating detritus, so they'd be referred as detritivores. Detritus just being dead, decaying organic matter. And then there's the hyporeic zone, which is the substrate below and adjacent to the stream. And so we have a lot of things that dwell within the sediment. So they're making this distinction here between things that swim, things that crawl on the bottom, and things that live within the sediment itself. And so this is what I kind of referenced earlier, is that there's a river continuum concept. As streams increase in size, detritus becomes less important as a food source, and fine organic matter, algae, and macrophytes become more important. So what the difference here is, detritus being nutrients from outside, leaf litter that falls in from trees, things from the riparian zone that fall in, the insects and animals in those smaller streams are what we refer to as shredders. So they're able to tear up and chew on leaves to give to obtain nutrition, where collectors consume fine particles in the water. So the objective of the smaller order upper streams is to really be fed by the land, and then further down there's both enough nutrients and organic matter washing down, as well as primary productivity happening within the stream, that they can be fed from that, as opposed to being fed from things growing more or less directly on the banks. We impact streams in a wide variety of ways, from sewage to waste to fertilizer runoff. If you're interested in streams, we have good stream ecology class here, as well as some water quality courses. So let me see if there's one. Yeah, we'll go through most of these. Deforestation, increase erosion. Pretty much any land use change increases erosion and increases sedimentation into the streams, which both changes those rocky streams into muddy streams, and then increases the turbidity, decreases water clarity, making it harder for light to penetrate through the streams. Dams obviously impact systems. The main function of dams is to slow water down, and when you slow water down, it gets warmer, streams get wider, things slow down and fundamentally change that way. So lakes and still waters are referred to as lentic. They occur where depression in the landscape fills with water. They can be created from a variety of ways. There is a big difference between a small surface area deep lake and a shallow lake with the same amount of volume. So you can think about, what's a good analogy? You could think about having a bucket of water, 5 gallons of water, and you could leave that 5 gallons of water in a bucket, and it's reasonably deep and has a reasonably small opening. Or you could pour it in across the table with like a 1-inch barrier all the way around, and it would be much wider and shallower. Same amount of water, same volume of water, but the water poured across the table with a small border around it, when exposed to the same energy from the sun, would warm up a lot more. It's shallow, and it has a larger sediment basin, has a larger benthos, and so with that there's more nutrient exchange, and so you've got a lot more light, a lot more nutrients. It's going to be dark green, it's going to be totally different compared to a deep lake with a small surface area, and a big difference between the lit parts of the lake where photosynthesis is happening, and the deep parts of the lake where nutrient recycling is happening. Those two are fairly discoupled, and so that lake is going to be much clearer. These are the same terms we use in the marine environment. So there's the pelagic zone, which is dominated by plankton. This is the upper parts of the lake, where plankton are exposed to light, associated with the photic zone, where light penetrates the water, and plankton can grow. Plankton in general just means small microscopic organisms suspended in water. Phytoplankton, phyto meaning plant, and plankton meaning small microscopic organisms suspended in water. Phytoplankton are generating energy based on the sunlight. They perform photosynthesis. They're restricted to the photic zone, which is the zone which has light. And then zooplankton are like zoo. They're not zooplankton, they're zooplankton. But like zoology, etc., animal plankton, zooplankton, are non-photosynthetic protists and tiny animals. Some protists, a fair amount of crustaceans, but they are typically making their living consuming phytoplankton or other zooplankton. And they can move up and down. Many of them actually undergo diel vertical migration. Diel vertical migration means coming up to the surface of the ocean or lake at night and back down during the day. Fat, tasty zooplankton are preyed upon by visual predators, so they'll come up to the surface, feed at night, and then go back down to the depths during the day to avoid predation. It's actually the largest migration on the Earth. Here's some images of these cute critters. Probably my favorite are Daphnia. They're pretty cool. So they can have eggs in the back, but they kind of fling their little arms around and around. Some copepods, a variety of algae, some rotifers. Just kind of an idea of what they look like in the microscopic under a light microscope. Copepods are pretty cool too. We'll learn about those more later. But they have these large antennae that can sense any sort of motion. And one thing that's interesting to think about with zooplankton is they live in the water. It's a profound statement, but they live in the water and they're much smaller than we are. Also a profound statement. So they're living in life with a low Reynolds number, and a Reynolds number is a way of thinking about how much does water drag upon you. If you're a blue whale, the drag of water is relatively minor compared to your body size. If you're a microscopic organism, you're experiencing water different than we are. So obviously you can run faster on land than we can run through the water. But if we were much smaller, say copepod size, it's not like experiencing water the way we experience water. It's more like living in honey. Or maybe honey could be too sticky. What's that? Pancake syrup, like maple syrup. Where if you see, and this is true for fish too, but it's really true for copepods and other zooplankton. If you see an object, let me try to come from the side here. If you see an object, like I can just reach out and grab it. But if you're living in the water at a low Reynolds number, you reach out and you try to grab the object, and as you squeeze down water, you're pushing the water, so the water's actually going to push out. So you try to grab the object, the water pushes it away. You try to grab the object, the water pushes it away. This is why you see a lot of fish are successful, what they call gape and suck, where they open their mouth and they pop their gills out, and it sucks water in. And so instead of trying to grab their prey, when they come to close their mouth, they would actually move water and shoot the prey away from them. Similarly, copepods will set up feeding currents, where it's like this little, they set up like two whirlpools in opposite directions, and then it just force feeds phytoplankton through them. It's kind of interesting. So we got, I think one or two more on freshwater, and we'll jump to marine. So this is the Littoral Zone and the Benthic Zone. Littoral just means near shore. It's where the photic zone reaches the bottom. So, anywhere near shore is the Littoral Zone, and the Benthic Zone is where detritus from the littoral and the pelagic zones is the primary source of food for animals, fungi, and bacteria. It may be cold and have low oxygen. So Littoral Zone, this is typically where photosynthesis is happening. So the primary source of energy for the system is sunlight, is driven by photosynthesis, where the Benthic Zone photosynthesis is directly not the primary driver of energy in that system. It's primarily getting energy via export from the littoral and pelagic zones. So either, the origin detritus, but detritus just means anything dead. So either fecal matter, which is a major source of energy, dead and decaying zooplankton, fish, algae that washes away, etc. It's the major source of energy for those areas. Okay, we're going to pause there, and I'll do part 2 about the marine environment.